Good afternoon. My name's Andrew Taylor. I'm a senior member of AQA's curriculum team. I'm joined this afternoon by Alex Scharaschkin, who, as it says there, is AQA's Executive Director of Research and Innovation. And he's going to talk to you and take your questions about this summer's results and the implications of those for GCSE and A-level, and also to take a look at the future of assessment. And my job will be to kind of manage your questions throughout. So you should be able to use the Q&A to ask questions, and there'll be a couple of points during the course of the hour where we'll stop to take some of those questions. But if a particularly burning point comes in, then I may even interrupt Alex in order to get that question asked. But in the main, we'll stick to the 2 question points. Just to say, this session is being recorded, and that's for the benefit of colleagues who aren't able to join at this time. We know how busy you are, and just that note there explains how the recording will be made available, but obviously make sure that all names are anonymized and GDPR is protected, and so on and so forth. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to invite Alex to take control, and he will start talking to you about last summer's outcomes.
Great, well, thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. I should say I'm not actually Andrew Bell, as it may say on my screen. I am actually Alex. I'm just for an IT technical reason logged in as Andrew for this afternoon. As Andrew Taylor said, what I'm going to say comes in 2 parts. First of all, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the summer 2023 A-level and GCSE results and have some questions on that. And then I'm going to, in the second half of the session, just kind of update you really on a few developments, areas we're working in AQA, particularly around the implications for digital technology and assessment and what some of that might look like as we go forward. So I'm going to start with the results for summer 2023, and just a bit of context before we come in get into any numbers. As you know, I'm sure, the kind of policy intention this summer just gone, was to return to pre-pandemic grading arrangements, but also to recognise that clearly education has been disrupted for those students who are taking exams in summer 2023, and therefore we were building in protection in the awarding process to kind of take account of that. But going into the summer series, we expected, and the kind of policy position from Ofqual in particular, was that national results would be similar to those in pre-pandemic years. So we're going to use 2019 as a kind of reference point for pre-pandemic outcomes in a moment. But the protection really means that a student, say, who would have achieved, for example here, a B grade in A-level geography before the pandemic, would be equally likely to get a B grade in summer 2023, even if their performance that they kind of turned in on the exam was a little bit weaker than it would have been pre-pandemic. That would be understandable. They should still get a grade B, and that's the kind of how we work to the awarding in summer 23. So on to outcomes, and the headlines are that overall, indeed, A-level results were similar to pre-pandemic outcomes, a little bit higher on average, and we'll come to a few subjects in a moment. There was also an increase in A-level entries. We had an increase of around just under 2.5% in terms of just the absolute numbers compared with 2022, and I'll say a bit more about this later, but as always, we set grade boundaries for every single specification, in each awarding series, based on how the assessment is performed, and they vary depending on the difficulty of the assessment to make sure that we neither advantaged nor disadvantaged students through the fact of having taken the particular paper that was that we used this year. So national entries for A levels increased as well by about 2% across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So that's essentially just a demographic change where over the next few years we are seeing a kind of pardon me, an increase in the number of 16 to 18-year-olds coming through. Nationally as well, across all exam boards and across all subjects, maths remains the most popular A level. We saw a big increase, or proportionately rather big increase in computing this year, which was interesting. And in terms of the top 10, economics now forms part of that top 10. You can, I don't know how easily it's for you to see this, the slide here. I'm looking at my view. I can see, I think the top 10 subjects down the side of that chart, and the yellow bars are showing kind of increases or decreases in entry for AQA entries in those subjects in 2023. And you can see the larger increase in economics that I mentioned there, for example. Now, when it comes to outcomes, we can, one of the few characteristics of students that we collect is information on gender. I'll come on in the second half of this presentation to talk a little bit more about data and how we might hopefully assist you a little bit with your own analyses of results in future with some other characteristics. We have gender and certainly I know in the results day presentations that the media attend, they're always very interested in the kind of question of attainment by gender. We have about 58% of AQA entries are from female students, so slightly higher than the national aggregate, which is 53.4%. That's partly due to the particular mix of subjects that we have large entries in at AQA. If you look at all A-level results aggregated across all subjects nationally, at grade A star, male students have a 0.3% lead over female students, while at A star to A, female students are slightly in the lead. If you look just at the results for AQA, as I say, we have a particular mix of subjects where we tend to have slightly higher female entry and slightly typically kind of higher performance from female students, and you can see that in the tables below, where you see that we tend to see the aggregate performance females slightly higher than males, and that's been maintained in 2023 as well as in the pre-pandemic figures for 2019 that you can see in the table. As I said at the beginning, broadly, results in summer 23 were very much in line with outcomes in 2019, which is what we were expecting and intending to be the case. But of course, there are subject by subject differences, and this table just collects together those subjects where we've seen a larger than an average or the largest increases in outcomes by comparison with 2019 pre-pandemic levels in 2023, and you can see there this is the proportion of students proportion of entries in those subjects which were graded at A or A star, so the cumulative percentage at grade A. In the column at the pardon me, the third column, the final column, it shows you the percentage point increase in the percentage of entries graded A or better in these subjects. These are relatively small entry subjects and ones where we do see a little bit of change in the cohort from year to year, which essentially explains why we are seeing a little bit more change in outcomes for these subjects than in some of the larger, more stable entry subjects. And the other side is where we've seen decreases. Actually, you can see that where we've had decreases, they have been actually rather small in outcomes by comparison with the increases we saw later, because broadly we are fairly close to 2019 outcomes across the piece. Again, in these subjects, we have seen a little bit of change in the entry composition, of the cohort entering in 2023 by comparison with 2019, and that's led to a slight decrease in outcomes at grade A and above in these subjects. Move on to GCSE. Again, similar to A-level, we're operating in exactly the same kind of policy constraints or parameters. So we would expect to see, and we did see, GCSE results in 2023 that was similar to the pre-pandemic, a typical pre-pandemic set of results. We're seeing, as I said, this demographic change, increases in the size of the cohort are coming through. AQA entries for GCSEs have increased by about 4%. That means we've got about just under 3.5 million entries that we had about this summer. And again, exactly as for A-level, of course, the grade boundaries are set to reflect appropriately the level of difficulty of the particular papers for each component and for the subject as a whole in the exam series in question. Overall, we're seeing that increase in the national increase in GCSE entries of nearly 5.9 million GCSE entries altogether in summer 2023. The top 10 most popular GCSE subjects are, I'm sure what you'd expect and have been the top 10 subjects for quite a while. Of course, the science double award comes in as over 900,000 entries there, because an entry is effectively each student has 2 entries, of course, counts as two entries for double award science. But you can see the figures for maths, English literature, history, geography, and so on, as you'd expect. Quite a big the biggest increase actually we had in amongst that top 10 was in history, interestingly, and art and design down a little bit, still a couple of 100,000 entries, but slightly down by comparison with 2022. Around these 10 subjects account for about over 75% of our GCSE entries overall at AQA, and English language is the most popular of the GCSEs that we offer. I think around around 500,000 or so entries with AQA English language. Bit more detail on English and maths specifically. We're seeing rises in both, a little bit more of a rise in entry in maths than in English, and in both of those subjects we had a bigger rise in the kind of post-16 entry in summer 23, so largely resitting candidates taking English and maths. Outcomes, GCSE, and here they are again broken down by gender. The gap at GCSE is bigger than at A-level. It has been for a long time, and you can see that in the tables here. At grade 7 and above, 2019 AQA entries, we had about 23.8% of female entries getting a 7 or above, and 17% male. So that's about, what's that, 6.8% percentage point difference in favour of females. If you look in 2023, you can see it's slightly narrowed, that gap. It's about 6.4% difference, percentage point difference. And at grade 4, we've got similarly in 2019, kind of pre-pandemic, last exams, kind of pre-pandemic, the gap was about 9.6 percentage points. It was 9.6 percentage points in favour of female students. 7.5% is the difference in 2023. So interesting to see that slight narrowing. I don't kind of be rather speculative to kind of speculate on why that might be the case, but very interesting to see. Here we have the subjects where we've seen, as I say, against a norm of very similar to pre-pandemic or slightly higher than pre-pandemic results in 23. We're against that norm. Here are the subjects which have had the kind of the largest increases in outcomes. again, rather small subjects on the whole, relatively small entries on the whole, and subjects in which we do see some change in entry between years. To compare, so I can just move forward one. Here we are. Yes, the decreases are also well, a couple of smaller language, Chinese, spoken Mandarin, and religious studies short course, which are rather, again, fairly small entries, and one where we do have a bit of volatility in candidates year on year. You'll see the single sciences, though, physics, biology, and chemistry, we've got a small decrease in the proportion of candidates who got grade 7 or better. Probably this is due to the fact that we saw an increase overall in single science entries, with some students who perhaps pre-pandemic would have taken the double award, being moved into the single sciences. And typically the single sciences have quite a high proficiency, so it's probably the relatively more able students from double science being moved across. But the consequence of bringing in some slightly less proficient students to the single sciences is you see a slight decline in the aggregate figures at grade 7, which we do. I'm just going to, sorry, I just check where we got to. Right, yes, there we are. Yes, sorry, English and math. So I'm going to just going to have a look at those couple of those pardon me, tables in just in graphical form. You can see by comparison here, English language, English literature, and maths. The red bars are the 2019 kind of a reference position for pre-pandemic. The light blue ones are 2023, and 2022 is given in the middle. Obviously, we're on that downward trajectory from 2022 back to kind of pre-pandemic, but slightly higher in all cases. English literature marginally higher, the other two rather higher than 2023. This is the percentage of students graded 7 or higher in each of these subjects. Biology, chemistry, and physics, I've just mentioned. We're seeing that these are the single sciences, we're seeing that very marginal decline by comparison with 2019, perhaps due to the slightly different makeup of the cohort this year in the single sciences. Geography and history, a very stable picture between 2019 and 2023. Just wanted to say a few words about inter-board comparability, because obviously I've been presenting AQA results here because that's where we have the data for. But when we do the process of awarding grades, we work very closely across all exam boards to make sure we work in exactly the same way, and we are completely comparable in our processes and in the data we use, for example, to compare the makeup of the cohort, for example, in terms of prior attainment year on year. And of course, Ofqual looks at the individual exam board results as well as looking at the national picture, and is able to take any action if it feels it's necessary to ensure that we are completely comparable, so there's no difference by board when it comes to grading standards. So just to finish on the outcomes part of the discussion today, the way we did the grading in 2023, we did use statistical predictions based on outcomes in summer 19 and looking at the makeup of the cohort in terms of prior attainment. We then asked our expert senior examiners to look at students' work around those the boundaries that would be suggested by that process. Pardon me, to ensure that the quality of work was acceptable. As I say, making some allowance for the fact that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be quite as high in terms of performance standard as we saw pre-pandemic. So basically, as it says there, we awarded exactly as we would have done in the kind of steady state pre-disruption due to COVID, whilst making some concessions for the context in which awarding was taking place. And hopefully we've ended up in a position which reflects those intentions and has kind of discharged the process successfully. So I'll stop there and turn over to Andrew for questions.
Thanks, Alex. So got a couple of questions in. If anybody's got a question to write, do put it in the Q&A. And if not, if possible, we'll also look to see if any hands are raised and people can let us know the question. But I've got a couple to deal with first of all. So the first one, this appeared when you were talking about changes in A-level boundaries, A-level outcomes, pardon me, but it probably applies to GCSE as well. And the question is, how do you decide to allow a 4% increase, for example, or any a substantial increase in, say, physics, rather than adjust the grade boundaries to keep things exactly the same?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Goes kind of to the heart of what we're doing in the awarding process, which is to ensure that we have been fair in setting the boundaries such that any improvements, for example, if that example of a 4% improvement in outcomes, reflect actual higher quality of performance by the cohort in that subject. So we would look, for example, at prior attainment, potentially other covariants of performance, to kind of give us some assurance that, yes, actually, we do have in that case, a slightly a better, more proficient entry for the subject, and therefore we would expect to see a higher proportion passing of that particular grade.
Okay, second question, which may end up being one for me, but I'll ask it you first, Alex, and then maybe I'll weigh in. The Maths Foundation paper shows a jump of 36 marks at grade 4 compared with 2019. This is causing anxiety in our maths department in terms of how to use papers for mocks this year and in selection of tiers of entry. Do you have any guidance or advice for this?
I can happy to kick off on that one, Andrew, but as I may ask you to support on the detail of maths. But actually, maths, of course, is a subject where we do see some not insubstantial changes in boundaries from year to year on occasion, due to the very close link between the particular items that are used in the paper and the difficulty of the paper. It's a bit different from something like English, for example, where really the kind of the items are. It's kind of more about how the marking criteria are applied to the items and the items themselves. Of course, we normally try and make papers very comparable in terms of their difficulty from year to year. Even when you do that in maths, you do, because you have to use different items from year to year. Sometimes you do have to allow for how the candidates have actually experienced them, if they're easier or harder. I think in maths, though, we were also making some deliberate attempts, and you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, Andrew, to actually make the papers a little bit more accessible, and therefore, in order, to maintain the standard, you would expect the boundary mark to go up a little bit to reflect that, and to hopefully give the candidates taking the foundation tier in particular a slightly better experience in terms of being able to be able to engage with the paper and gain some marks. But yes, in terms of just on mocks, I mean, as well, I would just make the general point on that if you're using one paper, one component of a subject as a mock, of course, we do set grade boundaries on the components, but they're kind of, as it were, notional grade boundaries. The most important thing is what is the subject grade boundary overall, because a student who gets a grade 4 in maths, for example, won't necessarily get a kind of a notional grade 4 on each component. They might do well on one and not so well on another. So those are a little bit notional. It's the subject grade boundary overall. But Andrew, do you want to add anything on the demand of the papers?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just, because I didn't say at the beginning, but I'll declare an interest here, because my role in the curriculum team is head of mathematics, so I'm very closely involved with this. As Alex said, we made a conscious effort to make the papers more accessible, and that work has started in 2022 but really came to fruition in 2023. So we were very happy to see students gaining more marks than they would have done in previous years in order to reach that same standard to get the comparable outcomes against 2019 that we saw in maths. So yeah, and that idea is it's all about making the papers more accessible, making that exam experience more positive. But I absolutely understand that then represents a challenge for heads of maths thinking about mocks and thinking about tiering and so on. In terms of mocks, you know, because the results, the outcomes are comparable, if you're using a past paper for a mock, then the grade boundaries for that paper or that set of papers will be will still represent the standard. So if you're using an older paper, then use the old grade boundaries. Similarly in maths, because we produce shadow papers, they should be of a very similar difficulty to the original paper. So the grade boundaries from that are the best guide we can offer. In terms of the most recent papers, obviously teachers will want to use the most recent papers and the most recent shadow papers as mocks. So you will have this summer's papers and the shadow and November's and the shadow, and they most closely represent the accessibility of the papers and the style of the papers going forward. So they would be the best one to use. In terms of tiers of entry, because the overall outcomes remain similar, I think my advice on tier of entry would remain the same, that a student who is expected to get grade 5 and may on a good day get a grade 6 should be doing the higher tier. A student who is most likely to get grade 4 and on a bad day might slip down into grade 3 should certainly be doing the foundation tier. And that foundation tier for students getting grade 4 and maybe going on to get grade 5 will represent a much more positive experience for them. So I would say generally, unless you think there's a chance of grade 6, or unless there are particular reasons to do with particular students that teachers will know, I would go with the foundation tier. And what we did see this year was from the foundation tier, most students who went past the boundary for grade 4, actually a higher percentage going on and achieving that grade 5. So even though the bar was higher in terms of marks, because of the greater accessibility, more students were reaching that bar. Okay, I'll stop talking about maths and look at another question. So the question come in, we were told that boundaries would return to 2019, but this did vary significantly and therefore caused issues. What are the plans for 2024? Alex, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I mean, I think the key point is outcomes were likely to return and did return to 2019 outcomes. So the proportion of students getting grades 4, 5, 6, 7 at GCSE or A star, whatever A level would be similar, and they have broadly been. Boundaries are set, as I said, each series to reflect the difficulty of the papers. So we weren't, necessarily expecting boundaries to look exactly the same as in 2019, as we wouldn't necessarily expect in 2019 to look the same as 2018, but we would expect outcomes to be broadly similar, certainly in aggregate across the country. For 2024, we are expecting to be, we're kind of not, unless I hear anything else from Ofqual over the next few months, we would be expecting essentially to have, we've now made we've kind of gone through the trajectory back to the pre-pandemic outcomes, and we would be expecting to kind of see those maintained in a kind of steady way over time. Obviously, then outcome to the extent that we're seeing better performances, we would see increases against the outcomes.
Thanks. All I'd add to that in terms of maths, where we've seen by design large increases in grade boundaries, by design the senior examining team now want to achieve that consistency that was in place before the pandemic. Now that we've shifted the accessibility of the papers, we want to return to consistency. Got quite a lengthy question, and I'm not sure. I'm sure I can't answer. I'm not sure whether you can, Alex. And it's about English language and English literature. And asking, can we explain why English Lang and English Lit GCSEs are marked in different ways? Lang markers, language markers work question by question. So, for example, they will mark question 4 and they will mark hundreds of question 4 and then move on. So the theory is that they are very well acquainted with marking that question and are therefore very consistent. However, with literature, the same examiner marks a whole paper before coming back to another one. So they will cover 4 very distinct styles of questions before moving on. I don't even know whether that's correct or not, because I don't know anything about the marking of English. But the question is, could that lead to inconsistency in lit because they are moving between different things each time they mark?
I mean, it shouldn't lead to inconsistency in terms of the way in which the standardization and kind of quality of marking in the first instance and the kind of quality assurance of the process while it's kind of in flight during the marking period occurs. It is the case, certainly, that, you know, depending on the structure of papers, some papers are marked kind of item by item, some papers are marked more holistically. And I have to say, I wouldn't want to kind of go into, because I'd probably make a mistake. So it might be one to come back to with a follow-up once we've checked the detail on this around the specifics of English. Simply just to make the broad point that yeah, there are, you know, some different approaches to how the kind of structure of the paper leads to the kind of approach to marking that's deployed, but we have very stringent and consistent quality assurance arrangements regarding the quality of that marking, however it's done across all subjects.
Okay, a couple more. Again, grade boundaries compared to 2022 have risen. This has resulted in this particular school in students dropping computer science. As a girls' school, they were trying to encourage computer science. What would we expect to see in 2024? And they're particularly concerned in computer science, and I'm not sure we were able to answer that, with paper 1 being particularly hard for students. So I think that's one we might have to take back to the computer science team. But so that general point about grade boundaries rising compared to 2022.
Yeah, I mean, not all. Yeah, I mean, there's been the grade boundaries. Some instances they've risen, and some instances they've gone down, actually, and it varies by paper and by subject within the you know, always the overall aim of ensuring that we maintain a kind of performance that is reasonable and represents the level that we would want, that the expert examiners we want to see associated with the grade in question. Indeed, this year, 2023, we were, and awarders were aiming to be a little bit generous, actually, by comparison with where they would normally be putting boundaries, because recognizing the disruption, but wanting to ensure that outcomes were similar, even if performance was a little weaker. So I'm hoping for I mean, again, I probably can't talk about the detail of computer science paper 1. It should be the case, though, that the boundary marks that have been set kind of reflect the difficulty of, or, you know, the relative demand of the paper, and you know, that demand won't be increased over time. So you know, the boundary marks will be set appropriately given the particular tasks that the paper consists of.
Okay, and I'm going to make this probably the final word on grade boundaries,
Yeah,
but it's an interesting one. There's that variable grade boundaries across languages in the MFL suite. Pointed out the German, for example, the grade 7 boundary was higher than for other language. Again, I assume that's just down to the varying difficulty of the papers. That even though they take the same structure, there will be difficulty.
Yes, I mean, it's not always possible to get them exactly the same, let's say, and you have to be alternate. The first consideration has to be kind of fairness to candidates. It has been, Ofqual in the past has, and people involved in MFL will know this, has taken some action to make French and German in particular a little bit more comparable in kind of difficulty with Spanish. It was felt that they were relatively a little harsh by comparison with Spanish, and that's been built into the grading for this series as well. Yeah, I mean, certainly we obviously come back on. We could come back on any kind of detailed further questions we want to put in afterwards. But yeah, conscious that we probably need to move on in a minute to the next section.
Yeah, I think so. So there are a number of questions, unfortunately, we've not been able to get to, but we will get to those later, and either we'll produce an FAQs document or we'll be able to respond to people. So any questions that have been asked, we'll be able to pick up and get those responded to. But I think given the time, and we don't want to run late, so I think if you want to move on, Alex, to look at big question, the future of assessment.
Sure, and it's a big question, so I'm only going to scratch a tiny bit of the surface of it right now. In fact, I'm conscious, as I think in the slides coming up, there is a bit of detail, so I think you'll be able to have a look at those, read those at your leisure afterwards, and I'll just try and pick out a few main points as we move through. I really wanted to focus on 4 developments. One is the kind of move towards digital examinations, on-screen examinations where that's appropriate and brings benefits, and talk a little bit about what we've been doing, exploring that within AQA. Second one is about some other types of assessments that we are exploring that we think are useful and beneficial in the way that we can use digital technology, and I'll give an example in relation to GCSE maths. Thirdly, a little bit about data. I mentioned this earlier, and we have a lot of data, obviously, at AQA, and trying to make that more useful to you in terms of what insights you can draw from it. And fourthly, I'll just touch on the subject of AI, artificial intelligence, which we've been doing quite a lot of work on in AQA for a while. And there's a lot one could say, but we can, again, maybe just mention a couple of things we're doing in that space. So first of all, on digital exams. So in other words, this is having students sit a component or components of GCSE or A-level assessments on screen. We've been exploring over the last couple of years what the practical kind of consequences and implications of such a move in due course could be, and we piloted some versions of on-screen assessments. Some of you attending may have been involved in those. To kind of get a sense of how students find those as an experience, what teachers and SLT members make of it, and kind of particularly what the how easy or difficult is that given infrastructure in schools actually to do as a potential way of running some examinations in the future. This slide sets out some of the findings from some of that work based on over 3,000 on-screen pilot exams, kind of mock pseudo exams in various GCSE subjects and A-level French as well. I was interested to see actually that students were generally fairly positive about the experience, and that quote there about typing rather than writing being on the whole something that they welcomed, despite the fact that many students, I guess, are, you know, using their phones a lot and on Instagram and you know, WhatsApp and so forth, but not necessarily doing a lot of typing in the way that we kind of do in our day-to-day lives when we're working in kind of offices or whatever. Interesting to see that. I thought that was quite interesting to see. And generally speaking, you know, of the students we spoke to, we found out actually the majority of them were in favour of the digital version of the exam, of taking exams digitally, which was also interesting. And we had a look at, you know, and I say part of the pilot was just looking at some of the different ways that could look in practice and what different platforms and systems would entail. We asked teachers as well whether they thought there were particular groups of students who could benefit from exams being taken on screen, or some exams being taken on screen, and you know, the kind of response on that was certainly for students with special educational needs. There's clearly there's a lot more you can do with a digital interface than with a paper one in terms of meeting some of the needs in a more kind of personalised way. So I could say more. I'm conscious of time. I could say more about on-screen exams. Happy to take kind of questions on that. But we are basically looking at what that could look like, and we'll be able to say more about that in due course. I wanted to pick up though on this question about using digital technology in assessment more broadly. Exams are one thing, and obviously when we're talking about things like a GCSE paper or an A-level paper, that's you know, has very specific requirements and kind of regulatory conditions about what can and can't be in it and how it has to be structured and so forth. If we just move away from that for a moment and think about other kinds of assessment, formative assessment, diagnostic assessment, there's a lot that you can do, and we're exploring, you know, using kind of the expertise we have within AQA and the kind of links to data and items from GCSE and A-level assessments in the past around supporting students in learning with kind of adaptive diagnostic tools. And we are, another thing we're piloting at the moment, we've been trialing, is what we're kind of calling a readiness for GCSE maths, a sort of an assessment that students could do at the end of Key Stage 3, just coming into Key Stage 4, which focuses on what we think are really the core elements of the GCSE maths syllabus specification, that if you don't feel confident and don't have confidence and competence in those, you are going to struggle with GCSE maths. So it's really focused on those, and not just identifying through a very quick adaptive test how students kind of are positioned in respect of those key concepts, where their strengths and weaknesses might be, but also why they are struggling with topics that they might be struggling with, because we've really based the whole assessment on a very rigorously thought through kind of pedagogical model, called concept map for these concepts, which I won't go into now, but it's something which the combination of that with then the ability through a digitally delivered assessment to adapt depending on how students respond, and to personalize feedback and follow up very, very personally to a student, I think is really something that's has a lot of promise, and we're really keen to take this further. And perhaps some of you, if you haven't been involved, we're probably talking to a number of colleges for another series of pilots in the autumn. On data, in summer 2023, we have launched a tool which in the first for 23 has been for multi-academy trusts, which allows hopefully a much more insightful, informative and useful kind of set of dashboards to be produced based on results for students within schools within the trust, which has, you know, let's see some feedback there from subject leads and subject heads in maths around the kind of being able to kind of much more kind of effectively collate information that you can get, of course, from systems and so at the moment, but we wanted to try and make it easier for you, and so we've been working on that, and in summer 2024 we're going to try and build on that to enhance essentially the kind of results analysis services that we provide at the moment, to make them much more useful and informative, including potentially working with you to use more demographic data to enable you to make better comparisons between centres and between different types of entrance for subjects. So again, hopefully something that will be helpful, and I think has a lot of promise in providing insights in ways that are a little bit harder to glean with our existing systems. We really want to move these forward and make them more useful to you. The final topic was AI, artificial intelligence. I'm going to skip a couple of well, actually, maybe I won't skip this slide, which is that we all know that, you know, AI is having a bit of a moment for various reasons, which we'll talk about if you're interested later. But clearly, it's going to be important as we move forward for teachers and for students to have some understanding of how AI broadly works, what some of the risks that attaching to the use of AI are, and some of the ethical issues around it, and how to use AI-enabled tools kind of critically and with understanding, both in teaching and learning, and in preparing for assessment tasks, and indeed perhaps in assessment tasks where appropriate. And I mean, I think there's a lot one could say there, but I'm going to move on because of time. I just wanted to say a little bit about how we are currently exploring AI at AQA. We've been looking at the question, when someone asked about quality assurance of marking in the earlier part of the presentation. We have a lot of, as you'd expect, very rigorous quality assurance processes in place at the moment, as marking happens, as our expert markers look at responses and apply the mark schemes and do that consistently and rigorously. And those processes will continue, but we have been exploring, can we use AI approaches to help us with that quality assurance? So, I mean, Jo Saxton, head of Ofqual, has said in the past, and I would agree with her on this, that, you know, high stakes exams are not going to be marked by robots, but we do believe that an informed use of AI can help professionals do their jobs more effectively and really focus their time and energy on those places where it's going to have most impact. So if you're a senior examiner in charge of a team of less experienced examiners, you want to be focusing your attention on those examiners who are you know, most at risk perhaps of not being applying the mark scheme in a completely standardized and consistent way. And this is this is what we're exploring at the moment, and it's actually quite interesting and quite promising where we got to on that. Clearly, another area that we would like to explore is the question of how we provide feedback, more personalized feedback to learners, and that maths readiness product I was talking about earlier would be kind of an example of potential application of that. When you do, particularly with these large language model, generative AI approaches, when you apply them, they don't always work. They're not, you know, there are some risks to be attended to, but there's also some potential there, which with appropriate kind of oversight and so on, can be really helpful in terms of giving useful feedback to learners. again, and you've probably been exploring some of this stuff yourself, and I know we will be talking with a number of sessions set up with various teachers and professionals around how people are kind of experiencing and using AI in the classroom and in their work more generally. Things like kind of drafting, initial drafting tasks, so whether that's in our world in assessment, writing draft tasks, not so much actually in the high stakes exams, but possibly in some of the other areas we work in, and also trying to reduce the burden of routine work as far as possible. That's clearly something which we'd like to explore further, and we're very conscious this all needs to be done in a kind of ethical way. There's quite a lot of ethical issues, copyright issues, intellectual property issues, all kinds that are thrown up by these new kind of technologies, and we're very, as a kind of independent education charity, very mindful of the need to kind of right from the start be clear in how we kind of position our own use of AI. So I do believe that we are going to see some transformations in what we teach and how we teach it and how we assess over the coming years. I think it's important that we all take some time to try and understand a bit more about the opportunities and risks of AI for educational assessment, but actually for education in general, and assessment in its wider sense, of course, is a really integral part of teaching and learning. I'm not just talking about exams. I'm talking here about the kind of day-to-day, perhaps more informal interactions with students that make up education in the round. And we do think there are some benefits, provided we tread cautiously, and hopefully in future sessions we'll be able to give you a bit more of an insight and a bit more detail on some of those as we work through some of the projects I've just outlined on the previous slide. So I think I'll stop there. Back to you, Andrew, if there's any questions.
Okay, so we've had a number of questions, but I think I can probably summarize them as one, and it's a very important concern. A number of people saying at the moment they can't envision having hundreds of students in an exam hall with laptops or tablets or whatever in front of them, and the schools and colleges just aren't set up for that scale of online exams, and so they're asking for your thoughts on that, and also for that key question of what do you see as the time scales for the point when on-screen high stakes examinations will become commonplace?
Well, first of all, to say, I mean, absolutely recognise that, and we're not talking about something where next year we're suddenly going to have everybody doing English GCSE on laptops in exam halls, but we would see within a few years' time the likelihood of the beginnings of an uptake or an offering and an uptake of subjects or components, where appropriate, subjects being done on screen, and kind of very mindful of the kind of practicalities of that. There's obviously lots of interesting kind of assessment questions that we can talk about in terms of validity, about better, more authentic assessment, about things that can help people with different kind of access arrangements and so on. But probably the most important thing, and it's probably the things come up in the questions, is the actual practicalities of making that work with kit, with infrastructure, and with kind of appropriate support and training for exams officers, for example, and for schools. You may know that Ofqual and DfE are kind of also very much involved in thinking about some of these practical issues, and are doing some work on that at the moment. Be able to say, I think they'll be able to say more about that perhaps in the new year. I don't want to kind of say anything about timelines more specifically than that just at the moment, other than to say, of course, while we've been piloting the kind of what it all looks like from a student perspective and so on, we've been extremely mindful of those issues, and I'm hoping that fairly soon we'll be able to say a bit more about precisely that question of a kind of what the trajectory might look like. I would also, just to finally say, for kind of avoidance of doubt, I wouldn't see it as being likely that, you know, all GCSE and A-level examinations are done on screen by such and such a date. It's likely that we'll see some subjects where, provided you can solve some of the practical issues, there are, you know, benefits that improve the exam experience for learners. Perhaps subjects where a lot of the assessment tasks involve producing text, typing, responding to text. But for other subjects, for example, maths, if we're just talking about maths again, with the current, you know, if you look at an A-level maths paper, it's probably not, you know, having to kind of type your, or, you know, using an interface that that puts an extra kind of barrier, if you like, between, you know, writing out your proof of an identity or something, or doing an integral or whatever. That, yeah, that may not, that's, you know, we don't want kind of irrelevant things distracting students, and maybe paper and pencil is paper and pen will remain best for that. So we, you know, it will be nuanced, and it will be not all a big bang.
Okay, so that was the main question coming in. If anybody, we've got a couple of minutes left. If there are any other questions that people want to put in quickly. And see if anything comes in the next moment or two. To appear to be, I'll keep an eye on that. So I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining the webinar this afternoon. I hope it's been useful. As we said earlier, those questions that we weren't able to answer, we will find a way of getting answers either to individuals or to all of you as appropriate, and we'll make sure that happens. Otherwise, Alex, have you got any final remarks?
No, just to echo that, thank you very much. Conscious that in that kind of second session there was you know, it's quite a lot of material that I didn't really talk about in detail, and I hope we do have the opportunity to cover some of that in future sessions as well. Thank you for coming today.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and have a lovely evening.